Well, it's here. The most wonderful time of the year. Does it feel wonderful yet? It's supposed to. It's the most wonderful time of the year, at least that's what we're told. And yet, even this season, this best of all seasons, is filled with its own set of anxieties and frustrations. Even this season is filled with things that we can't control, and that if we think about them too much, make us uneasy. For example, some of you already have Christmas presents under your tree. Good for you. And some of those presents have your name on them, and yet you don't know what's in the box. What's in the box? Is it going to be something that you like, or is it going to be something that you have to pretend to like? Is it going to be something that fits you or something you're going to want to return? Are you going to have to feign excitement so that Aunt Linda doesn't cry at Christmas? Aunt Linda always cries at Christmas. And then there's your oldest child. Maybe this Advent, it's been years since your oldest child has been home for the holidays, but this Advent, she's here. But she's bringing with her her friend. At least you think they're friends. Maybe they're more than friends. You don't know. You can't tell. And you feel bad that you don't know. Should you ask? Does it make you a bad parent that you don't know the relationship status of your own child? And then there's the office holiday party where you have to awkwardly sing karaoke with coworkers. Will you get stuck at a table with Jerry from accounting who always wants to talk politics and do his terrible Trump impression? Will your boss see you sneaking out early to avoid the white elephant gift exchange? And then what about that fourth quarter bonus? Some years you get it, some years you don't. You're hoping you get one this year, that you're not stuck with a subscription to the Jelly of the Month Club. Would it be too presumptuous of you to ask or assume that you're going to get it? Or should you just start preparing yourself now for finding another way to pay for all the items that are saved in your Amazon cart? Even in this most wonderful of seasons, there are uncertainties that lead to anxieties. As petty as those things may sound, they pile up. And even at this time of year, we are filled with angst. At least we can be. The good news of Advent, however, is that our days of angst and anxiety are numbered. They're coming to a close. Because the full promise, the great promise of Advent, which means appearing, is that this Jesus who arrived once in weakness, born as a baby in Bethlehem, is also going to appear. He's going to Advent again in the future. And in his first appearing, he brought with him the promise of peace that can be experienced now in the midst of all our anxieties. And at his return, he's going to bring a fullness of that peace, which David hints at in Psalm 112. Peace is a gift to God's people because Christ has come, and Christ will come again. The great message of Advent is that peace is given to God's people. That's what we're going to talk about throughout the season of Advent, how the arrival of Jesus means the end of fear for God's people. We're going to talk about a number of things that people are afraid of and how the arrival and return of Jesus means the end of all those fears. And it's practical because you and I have a long list of things that we're afraid of. And today we start at what's near the top of the list for many of us. Fear of the future. The decisions we make today can't control outcomes for tomorrow. We can do our best today, but we have ultimately no control over the future. And there's nothing we fear more than having no control. Most everybody has at least some sense of anxiety when they consider all the unknowns that lie before them in this thing we call the future. And some of you, I'm not here to point fingers or make fun of you, but some of you live in that anxiety over the unknown and the uncontrollable in the future. Some of you are what therapists would call a catastrophizer about the future. Anything that comes to you from the future immediately into your present, you assume it's bad. So for example, we all know that one person who gets a phone call from their child, who never calls but always texts, but when they call, they assume something terrible's happened. So before they even answer the phone, they assume something terrible happened. Someone has died, is their assumption, and they answer the phone with worry or with, do I need to call the police? Is everyone okay? You know that person. Maybe you are that person. Or there's the person who sees that a meeting has been set with their supervisor at work, and they assume, this is it. I'm getting laid off right at the holidays. That jerk would do it too. That's just your assumption. This is the kind of person who, when they give a gift to somebody else at Christmas, they assume the other person isn't going to like it, and so they hand them the gift, and as the other person opens it, they say, you're probably not going to like it, which is why the receipt is in the box. You assume the worst. You assume the future, with all of its uncertainty, is out to get you, and you live with a certain amount of anxiety. Psalm 112 is a future-focused psalm, and in it, King David writes about a future for God's people that is rosy and bright. Despite all of its uncertainties, where we tend to fill in the blanks with all kinds of bad things, David looks at the future with all of its uncertainties, and he assumes, with a heart full of faith, he assumes that it's going to be filled with great things for God's people. If you look at Psalm 111, the list is long. David says that our houses will be filled with blessings. Our hearts will be overflowing with grace and mercy for others. Our hands will be eager to show generosity. In the future, God's people will be unbothered by evil, satisfied with the things of God. But most notably, he writes that in the future, verse 7, we will have no fear of bad news. And our hearts will be without anxiety over the unknown. In verse 7 again, he says, we will be steadfast, trusting in the Lord. David says that in the future, for God's people, there will be a day where we not only enjoy material blessing and spiritual maturity, but we will possess an unshakable internal peace. Can you imagine not even having the slightest fear of bad news? David says a day is coming for God's people where they will have no fear of the future, no assumption or worry about bad things to come. Now, David is ultimately looking forward to the return of Christ, where the peace that Christ brings with him in part with his birth and his life and death and resurrection will be experienced in full. And certainly on that day, everything that David talks about for our future will be true. Homes overflowing with everything that they need, hearts filled with mercy and grace, a deep satisfaction with the things of God, hands ready to serve and give without end and without exception. Like all of that will be true. A mind that never goes to the worst possible thing, but always assumes and experiences the best thing. That will be true at Christ's return. But if I know anything about myself, and if who I am is true of who you are, then what I know is when I think of the future, even though I'm a man of faith, I tend not to have such a positive view of the future. I tend to forget all these promises, and I live in fear of the future. So my question is this: how is it that David, when he thinks of the future, is able to keep all of this hopeful stuff, this joyful stuff, this good stuff in mind? How is he able to have such a peace-filled and positive view of the future? And the answer to that actually comes in the previous psalm, in Psalm 111. Psalm 111 and 112 are meant to be enjoyed together. They're kind of two peas in a pod. They're a pair. And Psalm 112 looks ahead to the future where God's people will have all of this peace and abundance. But Psalm 111 looks backward. In Psalm 111, if you were to scan it, what you would see is that David is recounting the fact that God has this history of giving good things to his people. David is recounting the history of God with all his power and glory and might and holiness, using all of that to bless and benefit his people over and over again. And he kind of rehearses this. He talks in Psalm 111 about how God has provided everything for them, their daily provision for their most basic needs, their spiritual sustenance through his promises, how he rescued them from slavery in Egypt and from the hand of every other foe that they'd face. And so in Psalm 111, looking at all that God has done, David can't help but declare in verse 2 and in verse 9, "Great are the works of the Lord, holy and awesome is his name." And then he says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." The pondering of this past stirs within David what he calls fear of the Lord. When David says fear of the Lord, he's not talking about being afraid of God in terms of being afraid of punishment or rejection. In the context of the scriptures, fear of the Lord is often a reference to gratitude, humility, and awe mixed together. Gratitude for God's goodness, humility in the face of his greatness, and awe of his power, all mixed together. That's what's being referenced when the scriptures talk about fear of the Lord. Gratitude, humility, and awe is stirring in David's heart. He's mindful of the greatness and vastness and holiness of God, and yet how God uses this greatness and goodness to bless his people, including David. It fills him. It fills him with humility and awe and respect and gratitude. And he says, man, being in this place of humility, awe, respect, and gratitude in regards to God, this is the beginning of real wisdom, of having your eyes opened and knowing what life is all about. And looking at the past and having all of that stirred within him is what enables him to look at the future with such clarity and peace. He looks at the past, at God's goodness. He's filled with awe, and then he looks at the future with peace. That's it, my friends. The way forward into the future with peace, at least according to David, is looking at the past, the history of God's goodness, with awe. It's saying to yourself, this God who has used all of his goodness and his power and his might and his holiness to bless me in the past, I can be certain that he is going to be good to me in the future. Despite all of its unopened presents and unanswered calls and unattended meetings, despite all of it, I can be confident of his goodness. The way forward in peace is backward in awe. Let's test this out. Let's look backward in our own lives a little bit. Let's look at the past of how God has used his power and his might in our benefit and for our good. Certainly we could go way back. We could look at the Old Testament history, which is your history and mine. We're part of God's people. Look at the major and mighty things that he's done in Old Testament history. That counts. That certainly counts. But we could also look at your own life, your own specific individual history. And certainly you have stories of how God has come through for you over the years, or shown up for you, or answered a prayer for you. Yesterday, God answered a prayer for me. Yesterday. My Michigan Wolverines were more than 20-point underdogs to Ohio State. And I stood in my garage where I had been relegated by my wife because I like to scream at the television and it scares the kids. And I prayed, Lord, give me this one thing. And he answered, God is good. But in all seriousness, you have, and I have my stories of God's goodness in the past, don't you? And then you also know that, like, all the stuff of the present, like the breath in your lungs, gift from God's goodness. The technology in your pocket, gift from God's goodness. The people you like and love around you, gift from God's goodness. The pile of food that you threw down your gullet on Thursday, gift from God's goodness. All of it a gift. You can look at the immediate and extended past and go, God has used his goodness for my favor, for my benefit, for my good. You have a long list, don't you? Do you ever rehearse the list? Do you ever recount the ways that God has been good to you? And then think of the season of Advent that we're in right now. In this Advent season, what is it that we are looking back upon? What are we reflecting on? What in the past are we staring at so that it might stir awe in us? It is something greater than anything David recounted in Psalm 111. It's something more impactful, meaningful, personal, and beautiful than anything even you and I could list our own personal lives that God has done for us in the past. You know the answer. What is it we're looking back at? We're looking back at the God of the universe coming here. The God of the universe, God himself taking on human flesh, confronting human fears, wrapping himself in human frailty, and coming here for you. For you. Unsatisfied with the distance between him and you. Unwilling to live with the disconnection between him and you. He bridged the gap. He crossed the great divide, so to speak. He took on flesh, sending his only son to be born in weakness among us, wrapped in our frailty, confronting our fears so that through a life of perfect obedience, through a death that was sacrificial love, through a powerful resurrection from the dead, through all of that, he could face your greatest fears, conquer them, and claim you and wrap you in mercy and grace and give the promise of peace to you. He did all of that for you. That's what we're looking back on. We're looking back on that moment of the incarnation, where a God who is far, or so it seems, and holy, and he is, comes close, puts on flesh, to be near and to be known by, and to love you. He did that. In your history, my history, our history, and we look back on that so that it might stir awe in us today. And as we look at an uncertain future, give us some palpable and real peace. John Owen once called the incarnation an incomprehensible work of wisdom, love, and power. An incomprehensible work of wisdom, love, and power. What David invites us to do in the Psalms as we face uncertain futures is to let our fear of the future be vanquished, or at the very least start to fade a little bit as we look at this past of the objective truths of God's goodness. And at the top of that list of the things he's done objectively in this world for you, we see him. We see him in the person and work of Christ, drawing close, living, dying, and rising for you. He did that the path forward in peace. He can be trusted with this, is looking back with awe. You know, for many of us, when we look at the future, when we try to tackle the unknowns of the future, we do so by trying to anticipate the worst case scenarios. We try to think of all the terrible things that could happen. We try to make a list of all the tragedies that could occur and steel ourselves against them, or prepare for them, or try to mitigate them somehow. And certainly that's helpful to a degree. It's good to be prepared, but what you quickly discover is that you simply cannot control everything. It's one thing to be prepared for the future, it's another to be obsessed over it. Ask anyone who deals with chronic anxiety how well it's serving them to be obsessed with all the things they can't control in the future, and they'll tell you, it doesn't really work for them. It doesn't work. The only thing that you can guarantee for yourself if you obsess over the uncertainties of the future, if you are always future focused, is that you will have anxiety that ruins today. That's the only guarantee. The future is like the sun in the sky. It's always hanging out there. And you can, if you want, you can stare at it. But if you do, it will blind you and make it impossible for you to see and enjoy what's right in front of you. And so David very wisely invites the church to move forward with peace by looking back with awe. So what if, all right, taking all of this, what if then, at the start of Advent, we're at the very beginning of Advent, what if then at the start of Advent we decided to take this seriously and we said, okay, I'm going to make Advent this year a year where I try to vanquish or at least minimize my fear of the future by making sure that I, as much as I can in this Advent season, focus on the gift of God being sent to me in Jesus Christ, focusing on that gift of the past so that I can have a little less fear as I face the uncertain future of 2025. What if I made this a devotional season, focusing on the goodness of God that has been so that I can have more peace as I venture into what will be? So here's how this might work. Just go with me on this, and this might sound a little cheesy to you, but just humor me, okay? What if, as you decorate your house, assuming some of you haven't already completely decorated your home? I know some of you weirdos did it in September, all right? And I mean weirdo in the most loving but most literal way possible. So weird to decorate your house for Christmas before Thanksgiving. But hey, Lord loves you and God forgives you, all right? But assuming there's some decorating left to do, what if, and just go with me, what if rather than making it an act of decorating, you made it also an act of devotion, okay? As you hang lights in the quiet of your own heart and mind, as a child of God, you say to yourself, look, I'm hanging lights not just to make a memory for my kids or to create some nostalgia for myself. I'm hanging lights because I believe that in the past, the light of the world has come into the world, and that's what these lights mean to me. This is evidence that God has been good and my future will be fine. So I'm hanging some lights. White lights, not colored lights, all right? Or as you wrap presents, that can be a devotional act as well. You're wrapping presents for kids and coworkers and distant cousins. You're wrapping presents. And rather than merely focus on the wrapping of the present, everything can become a devotional act. It's a devotional act where you remember, I'm wrapping presents. I'm giving gifts with no strings attached because I believe this is a representation of this is what God has done for me in Jesus Christ. He gave a gift in his own son with no strings attached. So I give a gift to my annoying cousin with no strings attached. That's what this means. This is a physical manifestation of the fact that God has been good in the past, and my future beyond Christmas is going to be fine. Or as you set up the nativity scene on the mantle, and you put all the parts and pieces in place, and you discover which parts and pieces the kids lost from last year. As you put all the parts and pieces in place, and you marvel at, look how small this baby Jesus is. Look how small this is. Rather than just put it perfectly on the mantle, it becomes a devotional act, and you say to yourself, because you're a follower of God, filled with his own spirit, you say to yourself, look how small little baby Jesus is. Look at this. This is a picture of the fact that God in Christ became so small for me to be close to me. This is what this is about for me. And God, who has done this in the past, He's going to be good to me in the future. God has been good in the past. My future will be fine. Or as you cram in here on Christmas Eve and you crowd into these pews, you try to keep the kids distracted because they're so doped up on sugar and hyped up on the prospect of presents, and you sing "Oh Holy Night," and you look at the chaos around you in this pew and you think to yourself, rather than let's just get this over so we can go to grandma's, you think to yourself, this beautiful moment is a picture of what Jesus Christ entered into, this craziness, this chaos, this crowded world. He came into this place. What this represents to me is not just the chaos of this church and my family. This is a picture of God's goodness in the past, and so my future will be fine. You see, you can make the season not just about going through the motions of the season, but a devotional act whereby you can look at the past, stir awe in the present, and hopefully, by the grace of God, have a little more peace as you face the unknown. Because the God who was good then loves you now and will be good out there. Corrie ten Boom once said these words, and I think they're wonderful. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. And at Advent, what do we know about God? He came close for me. That's who he is. And that's who's with you out there. There are lots of things in this world that we can't predict. We don't know what's going to happen. Will my health hold up into later years? Will my kids grow up and be fine, upstanding human beings? Will I be able to get through the holidays without once hearing Mariah Carey's "All I Want for Christmas Is You"? We don't know. We don't have answers to these things. We can only hope and pray. In the face of what we don't know, what we don't do is catastrophize or try to kid ourselves and obsess over our own control. What people of faith do in order to walk confidently into an unknown future is we look backward at a sure and certain past, at the goodness of what God has done in sending his Son into this world to live, die, and rise for us. That same God who did that then will be good tomorrow and reigns and rules with grace and mercy over every moment in between. You want to have a little less fear in the future? The way forward with peace is looking backward in this season at the baby with awe. Amen.